The next subject I'll be discussing is global resets for CSS. After working with our HTML5 start HTML file, we are now ready to move on to the next step in setting our layout. And this one is dealing with CSS resets. So I'll ask you to double click on the icon for Reset HTML. If you wish, you can continue working with the file that we were working with in the last video. So double-clicking that should open up reset.html here for you. As you'll see, it's pretty much the same file that you were working on just a second ago, but we're going to link to another CSS file and do a couple of things with this. First of all, if you look at the reset CSS file that's located right here, you'll see that there's a number of things that are commented out. The only thing that's actually active at this moment is what we did in the last video, setting the HTML5 display rule so that all of these new elements will be displayed as block level. At this point, we're going to be now talking about how to reset our entire page so that it eliminates a lot of inconsistencies from one browser to the next. Number one, it reduces bad styles. It undoes a lot of the styles that you find in most major browsers. Ones that simply don't work very well, like using an outline to highlight items that are in focus when you're in form fields. Other different elements. Great for keyboard navigation, but perhaps not what we want to be talking about right now. And basically, from one browser to the next, you might find proprietary ways of dealing with margin that are larger than other ones or smaller. And there's a lot of other things that can go wrong. So it's often a good idea to reset your CSS elements. Now, one of the ways that we can create a reset is by using something called the universal selector. This was developed by Yahoo as a CSS reset, and essentially what it does is it uses the asterisk as the selector. In doing this, it's stating every single one of these properties that I have listed here are going to be applied to absolutely every single HTML element. No matter what it is, it has now been reset to 0. Let's talk about these individual ones ourselves. Now look, you can always just copy paste the information that I've given you here and use it in your code. But if you wanted to create it with Dreamweaver, there's a way of doing that. For example, right now, if we went to our CSS styles window, you'll see that reset.css has some information here. But remember, the only thing that's active inside of reset.css is our HTML5 display rule. So that's exactly what's happening here. It's just saying display things as a block. Good. Now, if we wanted to create a universal selector as our reset, what we would do is click on the new CSS rule that we have right here. And at this point, we would go to tag. We'd redefine a tag. Now, a universal selector is not really a tag, but it will work in this instance in Dreamweaver. So if I were to say, put this in reset.css, clicking OK, let's look at that again. First thing, if I came in here and set the universal selector to have 0 margin and 0 padding, when I apply that, you can see exactly what's happened. All of that default space that was in there is now gone. And if we were to look at our code, nothing's really changed to the HTML. It's only the CSS we're affecting. And all that's happening here is that this asterisk is dictating exactly how we are going to be seeing not only what we see here, but every single HTML file that we can think of, even the ones that we don't see or are using at the moment. Now you get the idea of how the universal selector is working. Anything that we use with this selector is going to be affecting absolutely everything on this page. If I were to remove this, I'm going to go back up to the top and you'll see here I've got a complete and total reset using a universal selector. I'm just going to remove the last asterisk and / here using Command X or Control X on a PC. And I'll paste it up here to make my comment only last this long instead of the entire area that I had commented out. As you'll see, to the margin and padding, I've also now included border 0. Nothing is going to have a border. I don't want any goofy style that some browser thinks is cool to have a border when I don't want it to be there in my design. So we're going to ensure that no borders are going to be used here. Outline is also going to be set to 0. If you remember, I talked about that when discussing things like form elements. We're going to remove all of that because it's kind of goofy and I don't really want it. And if I did want it, I'd put it in myself. Font size set to 100, as you'll see here, that's going to eliminate some of the sizes of these elements, but that's okay because if things like our headers are made smaller by using this, we're going to style that font ourselves later and we'll have much more control over things, including the amount of margin that's on those elements. Line height set to 1.5 ems. We'll be discussing more about ems and line height in the typography chapter, so we'll talk more about that, but that's basically the amount of space that each of these elements have from one line to another. If we were to remove that, you could see the effects of having no line height. Vertical align baseline ensures that everything is going to be aligned right at the same baseline for the text, so that's usually one that we include as well. Text decoration none. This one's an interesting one. Basically, anything that default had an underline, like a link for that matter, will not have one at the start. But that's okay, because if we want to put one in inside of paragraphs or otherwise, we can do that ourselves later. So right now, this has been what we will see when we apply all of these resets to absolutely every single element using the universal selector. Generally speaking, we would ask ourselves, well, if this was working perfectly, why do we need to have something like a limited reset? So let's take a look at the limited reset instead. I'm going to remove this ending of the comment by pressing Command or Control X, and I'm going to put it right after this closing bracket, Command V or Control V. Then these are both commented out, so I'll remove the comment at the bottom of this one, Command X, and I'll move it up here, Command V. So now we have this limited reset in action. And basically, it's doing pretty much the same thing that the other one was doing. The only difference is instead of using a universal selector, it's got a much longer set of elements, but in fact, it's not affecting absolutely every single HTML element. It's only affecting these that we have here. It's a little bit more limited than the universal selector, but oftentimes some of the elements that are omitted from this list are important to have their own basic resets. So, which one should you use? Well, I think we're going to use the limited reset, but remember, I could do this inside of Dreamweaver as well. Come here and we can set a new CSS rule, and then we would choose tag, and we would say HTML, comma, body, comma, div, comma, section, comma, and we could write it all out there. But in the time that it would take you to do that, it'd be a lot quicker for you to just copy paste this from my files that I've given you. Remember, you can always use a universal selector instead of all of these, but this is a useful thing to have in any layout. And notice, oh, our poor H1 header looks a lot smaller. Don't worry, the code is still saying it's a H1 header if you look at the source code here, but the difference being, we'll have more control now on how this header is going to look and what we're going to do with it. So this is the reason that we choose to set a global CSS reset, and the limited reset is the one that we're going to be using. Now, one last thing. Do notice that if I were to remove this complete and total reset here, and even, this goofy little global styles design that I've got up here, we'd basically be seeing that this limited reset happens first. And that's very much the paradigm when we're resetting our CSS. Why? Because it loads first, and that's the first thing that we want to have happen. All of these things should take place before anything else takes place. So it's usually something that we put at the very beginning of our CSS. So come back in the next video, and we're going to start building up the positioning for our layout.